We are back for once again another Ecolopto Polymath Salon on Professor Barinholtz's channel. And today we're doing an interesting discussion between Professor Barinholtz, so Alon, and then the Wolfram Institute's Dugan Hammock, who you're also probably extremely familiar with at this point on the channel. And they'll be talking about a couple of things. In particular, we'll start things off, about the similarities between language and autoregression and computational irreducibility. But before we move right into the discussion, let's take a quick intro from Alon and then Dugan. So Alon, you first.
Hey everybody, Lon Barinholtz. I am co-director of the Machine Perception Cognitive Robotics Lab at Florida Atlantic University and trying to solve the world's mysteries with autoregressive theoretical framework.
Dugan.
Dugan Hammock. I'm a mathematician, geometer, and artist. I work for the Wolfram Institute as a research coordinator, and I'm here to talk about cellular automata.
Wonderful. So I think we can just kind of roll right into that. I guess the first question is, which you guys have been thinking about a bit, is, in what ways is language or autoregression computationally reducible or irreducible?
Yeah, and I want to hand it off actually to Dugan first. Maybe he can talk about what these cellular automata are and what the concept of computational irreducibility is. It's Stephen Wolfram's term, I believe, invented term. In relation specifically to CAs, but I think it has an incredibly valuable application in the case of these large language models, which we'll get to. But Dugan, why don't you take it away? I think you can have some visuals.
So, all right. So, yeah, cellular automata is basically you have a grid of pixels, and then or a line of pixels basically, and then you have update rules which advance from the next one line to the next according to some simple function. And I should have some more basic examples, but
sorry, I kind of threw it at you. I didn't know if that's what you were planning on explaining.
I had prepared some usually there are so you usually have like a line of discrete values, and the next line is sort of a rule-based thing that produces discrete values out. What I had prepared was sort of a investigation into continuous cellular automata, which have very interesting behaviors that I've been finding in the past few weeks while working at the Wolfram Summer School. So in this setup, there are you are having a fixed discrete grid of cells, so that is still true, but what you are allowing for are a non-discrete set of values that each cell can possess, so a scalar value in this case. The rule here is to for any given cell on the next row, look up to the three cells adjacent to it and take the average. So here 0 plus 0 plus 1 is 1. Divide that by 3, you get the third. Here this is 0 plus 0 plus a third. It's 1/3. Divide that by 3, you get 1/9. So you get 0.1 repeating, etc. If you keep doing that, then you sort of have a behavior which here the value here gets distributed evenly across these three values, the cells, and then you get diffusion basically. And so here it's the case that every the total across every row is 1 unit. Here this is
just sorry, dude. Just to clarify for folks, because I've often experienced people can get confused when looking at these. Just to show like time is what's happening. That each row is sort of generated time. With arrow of time. Because
that's a good point. Yeah. So each row is being generated off the row previous in a downward step, such that you're advancing the state of the whole line, and to keep track of the history of what the computation is, you stack the lines vertically. starting at the top and working your way down. So time in this case starts at the top and goes downward. And it's sort of the case that each computation of the next row down, being reliant upon the one previous, is sort of, you don't know, for instance, what's going to happen at row 5 or row 6 without first computing all the rows in between. So you have to start at the top and work your way down. There's no shortcuts typically in this sort of setup.
And I just wanted to mention here, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but it's worth mentioning that this isn't like we don't know or we don't have patterns to know. This is like it's mathematically unknowable without doing as much or more work than just computing the next line. And it's sort of a deep foundation.
That's the claim, right? That's the claim of computational irreducibility. That if you want to know what's going on at line 6, that you can't do it closed form. There's no equation that'll get you there from row 1 to row 6. You just have to run it.
Sometimes you get lucky, depending on the rules, depending on the breaks. You might have a pattern that's very simple, such that you can know about it. But in the general cases, it can be very wild or pseudo-random, as the case may be, especially for Rule 30.
Can you elaborate? I know you want to jump more into the continuous aspect, but the notion of is this a claim or is this sort of mathematically provable that there's similar, like in chaotic systems, there's a certain sense in which you can actually truly demonstrate that there's that they're chaotic and therefore there's this that the system has to evolve, and is this something similar in these cases?
That's a good question. I mean, how do you prove that something's chaotic? I guess there are analyses of this sort of system where they hit it with all the standard tests of what it means for a signal to be random, and it passes all the entropy tests, and for all intents and purposes, it is pseudo-random.
Yeah, and it's not like sort of epistemologically like mathematically provable and true in some sense. It's more of a practical case for chaotic systems. And is the Wolfram claim that they're fundamentally that God the mathematician couldn't do this prediction in a closed form way, or is it more similar, I guess, to sort of a pragmatic, practical kind of unpredictability?
I mean, it sort of is predictable in a closed form where you just have to compute every step from the top down.
Yeah, you just have to do it, right? I mean, but exactly. But there isn't. It's sort of like a computation. There isn't a sort of like a Kolmogorov kind of sense that there isn't a computationally more efficient way to do it than to just actually run it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it's interesting that Rule 30 in particular has a sort of repeating effect on motifs on the left side, and on the right side it's sort of random. You can in fact like highlight where that boundary is, and then there's sort of angle that it propagates at. So you have this sort of boundary between randomness and just a complexity that's has a rhythm to it. Yeah, and it's fun fact that these sort of patterns are found in nature with actual cells that are actually growing, having some sort of pigment in each cell, and then the pigment kind of spreads neighbor to neighbor in a particular way. But so I just wanted to show you some interesting examples of moving away from so you have a fixed grid. This is with 2 colors. So this is a very, very simple model for computational irreducibility and pseudo-random behavior. Might be one of the simplest models possible. which is exciting because, when you have the simpler, when you're trying to model a phenomenon and you have a minimal model of computation that exhibits that phenomenon, in this case pseudo-randomness, the smaller your model, the more you've captured like the essence, the boiled it down of what it is. So, it's an interesting thing. To kind of blow the lid off of what kind of random types of things you can get out of a cellular automata with a fixed grid, but scalar values, floating point values in each cell. I started looking into these continuous cellular automata, and I found some very interesting behaviors. So here is, so this is extending the work that Stephen did in the 90s. So take the three, you take their average, and you plot the result. That'll give you this diffusion pattern. However, if you take the average, in this case 1/3, and you plug it into this function with there has a discontinuity here. So you're taking the fractional part of x times 3/2. So I guess if we have a 1 multiplied by 3/2, and you take the fractional part of that, you get 1/2. So here it goes from 1 to 0.5, and then you keep doing that, right? So here this gives this plot. So you see like some triangles here, but it's has a lot of randomness to it. You change the activation function again and get different results. Here's when you alter one of the parameters to that activation function, you get all kinds of some different behaviors. And zooming out, you see what type of textures you can get out of these types of systems. And so I think that these are very interesting to look at and to kind of puzzle over. They're very sensitive to what these parameters are. Here, the parameters for the slope and the offset in this activation function are given below. So this is, something like take 1 times x plus an offset of 0.392001. Take the fractional part, so you get this kind of jump. Decreasing the slope will typically lead to more well-behaved systems. Oftentimes, this will jump. That is, there's a little dot up here at the top, and then nothing else ever happens, but you perturb the parameters slightly, and you'll get something that has a sustained life. And sort of a wider variety than you get for just the discrete value case cellular automata. Some notable examples that I found are stuff that sort of hops, skips, and jumps. You get like little dots coming down every once in a while. In between these events, there's sort of very low level floating point values, scalar values that are bubbling under the hood, so to speak, hidden. But like approaching a threshold. When they get to a threshold, you get a little spike here, and then they'll leave some sub-threshold values percolating, and then you kind of get some stuff happening, and then some stuff not happening anymore. Eventually, this peters out and then dies forever. And so I thought that's interesting behavior that I'd like to know more about. Here again, stuff happens. Then you have repeating elements here that converge, sort of drift, collide, and then go extinct. And here's something where it starts with some elements, some repeaters, some drifters, gliders, so to speak, and then you get into endless repetition. Here's sort of some motifs along the border, and then just very highly structured repeating elements going down. Again, this is the same sort of system here. This one I find interesting because there are sort of isolated events being peppered throughout. This one I'm not sure what's going on. This is sort of like getting bigger, wider, and I think after this it peters out and stops. Here's an interesting one where it's very computationally reducible along the sides and within the voids of these triangles. So this is very reminiscent of some of the triangular cellular automata that rule 90, I believe. Here's sort of, I see this a lot. So there are repeating elements along the side and then chaos in the middle. Again, here's something that looks like rule 30. Repeating elements along the sides, chaos in the middle, and some sort of boundary between the two on either side. This one surprised me because you have repeating elements and then like some blank under the hood values percolating, and then a threshold event is seen. These repeating elements get further apart until something happens where you have some chaos coming in. Here's another repeater. And these are a lot of fun. I like the fact that this one has a heart up top and then never shows up again. Here's some repeating elements that drift apart. This one's just bizarre. I'm not sure what this gap here is or why it's there, but it's interesting that it exists. Interesting that this one has two different textures. These V's keep getting bigger. Very strange. This one has a lot of isolated elements coming in here. I wonder how, it just makes me wonder. Here, the isolated dots just stop existing after a while. I like these dendrites. Here's another finite lifetime one that just does some stuff and then stops. Again, finite lifetime.
Next time.
Oh. This one is very surprising, and I have to investigate this further because it does one element, repeats once in place, and then stops. So I'm not sure why it died out, but here's a similar configuration where it repeats itself to the left and to the right, and then it stops. And this is all in a 2-parameter system for continuous cellular automata.
So what's your process like? Do you start to get a feel for it at all, or is it literally just going back to our irreducibility, there's just these complete discrete discontinuities when you change a parameter by a small amount, and now you've got a radically different thing. Or, I'm just curious, like if you literally did it, is there
These
an
are
animated version of
extremely
this where you?
sensitive to initial condition. So,
So it really is
um,
pretty much chaotic.
so the parameters are the slope of this line and the offset, right? So mx plus b, and for the b parameter, I set up some sliders here to sort of perturb the amount by 1/1,000,000th, let's say. So if I do that, you can see in chunks it has an effect downstream, altering this by a 10 millionth.
This behavior where the pattern repeats itself and then it stops, or where it has a couple children and then it stops. Do you notice this with discrete cellular automata, or is this one unique to continuous cellular automata?
It's unique to continuous cellular automata. Basically, with the discrete model, if you have a repeated thing, it's going to do the same thing after that, no matter what. So it's very deterministic. Here, it's like the values could be slightly off, but be mostly the same. And then the values are slightly off from the original, don't have to have the same behavior as the previous. So it's like because there's sort of some epsilons and deltas happening that you have this what look to be repeated elements. Although it is true that if you repeated the same exact values on one line as another line, then you would have deterministic behavior.
I'm sure you know this, and I'm not questioning the Wolfram language, but I'm curious if this weird behavior could just be due to floating point errors, since you're working with continuous numbers.
Right. So I have looked into, I've verified some of these examples using precise arithmetic. Especially in this sense of you can stay within the rational numbers, for instance, to get exact arithmetic. And yeah, especially the one that sort of repeated itself once on left and right and then stopped. I did check that one thoroughly.
So I guess there's a almost like because of the computational reducibility, it almost seems, and I think it's related to the broader conversation. Is there any insight to be had, right, about the behavior of these things at all? Is it short of, well, you just had maybe that, you could draw some sort of insight about the continuous versus discrete, actual representations of their values and things like that. But other than that, what can one say, except to just run it and discover? And I guess what's the
Yeah.
nature of this kind of what kind of discoveries? One kind of discovery is that you have these kinds of some of these extraordinary patterns emerge just from these simple rules. I think and those are valuable insights and discoveries. But is there anything more that we as humans can capture in the way we like to, in a compressed form, where we can say something like, oh, not just that happens, but it happens because, right? Is there some notion of
I
insight
think
like
Dan
that?
just left because he knows you're about to bring up auto generation.
Get those shot glasses ready, guys.
Yeah, I don't.
And if the answer is
I
that,
have no explanation
I
for
don't
why
mean to
these
put you on the
patterns are
spot.
emerging. Yeah.
I guess, and then the deeper question is, do you think that is, our own lack of creativity and imagination to be able to do that there are, or is it really fundamental that there is nothing, there are no underlying simpler, like, again, this comes back to the computational irreducibility, that there's nothing more to be said. These are brute facts, sort of certain kind of evolution of certain kinds of systems.
Right. So I mean, the setup for the system is simple. You have a simple rule, a simple algorithm, simple to define activation function, let's say. You have things interacting with your immediate neighbors only. So, but you string this up and you get a complex behavior out of the system. you know,
Is there any
but
relationship between like the number of rules or I guess or the inherent complexity of the rules, say, like let's say it takes into account more than immediate neighbors, right? You could have a convolution. You could do it in 2D. There's lots of
right,
things you could
right. So
do.
you could have a two-dimensional system. You could have each cell sort of look at a neighborhood around it, and then
Right.
it
Is
would
there
be a
something to be
two-dimensional
said
neighborhood.
about, right? And is there, in terms of evolving complexity, and I don't know exactly how you're measuring complexity, but I guess we can all say, hey, look, repetition is less complex than what looks appears to be, complete noise. And maybe are there certain kinds of, perhaps maybe there's some, something that we can capture in terms of relations on one end of of that equation on the other one.
You know, I mean, this is very close to what happens with neurons or MLPs, multi-layer perceptrons. It's just you're adding up influences from your neighbors, putting it through a activation function, and then putting out an output to be read again. So, what is the nature of these emergent behaviors? Sort of, what's the nature of cognition? It has some
Yeah,
parallels
fair
to.
enough. I'll briefly mention I don't want to get too deep down this rabbit hole, but neural cellular automata where the rules are learnable, you can end up with, and it's something one my PhD student Suboshet worked on. You can actually have a, with backprop, you can get to a specific desired outcome of the entire state of the system by backwards learning the rules from the desired outcome. So there's certainly it's possible to generate structure in a kind of forward way using these rules, although you end up having to do much more complex rules than the standard set of cellular automata rules.
Well, so
Um,
is that what you say learn the rules? So is that sort of you have a neural net and then you're trying to, for instance, pick which activation function is best for the training set?
so yeah, I mean it's about learning those update rules. Like if you could see um, the neighboring values as being the discrete inputs, and then based on those inputs, you update, and it's a learnable rule for what the update rule is, and so
Oh,
you can get from there to you might want to check it out. There was an original paper that did this. They show an original image, and then they use NCAs to be able to learn a set of rules that then, given a starting point, lo and behold, the thing emerges. I think it's a salamander is like the first kind of famous example
Oh,
of
right,
that.
right. It's like it tries to recreate this pattern and it could be perturbed and then it would grow back.
Exactly. Now what we actually tried to use this for research purposes to actually solve problems.
Mhm.
It wasn't particularly successful, and I think we're butting up against it's one thing to go backwards after the fact to fine tune the set of rules such that you end up with a certain outcome, but very different to say, here's simple set of rules. What's that going to give you? And so I think the really interesting thing about these things mostly is mostly the emergent structure that you don't anticipate that comes out of from simplicity, as opposed to I don't know where the NCA literature is now. I don't know how much utility people have gotten out of it. It was a very cool that you can do that, but doesn't quite jive with sort of the spirit of the original conception.
Yeah. Let me think about this. Hold on.
can I
So
say
you
something real
mentioned
quick?
like, oh, you have a particular, you're trying to learn the rules for a particular output.
Such that you can get a particular outcome exactly.
Uh-huh.
And and then you basically you do back propagation based on error, and you say no, you should have had this value given those values, and then you update.
I've previously experimented with convolutional cellular automata. Essentially, it looks at like the grids, the image, the pixels surrounding it, and depending on the pixel, applies like a transformation. Like I've done it before with like colors, so you kind of just like put an image in and you get a new image out, and so on and so forth. And I wasn't really like trying to get a specific end behavior. Um, but now I'm wondering if you could use what you're talking about to get like this solitonic behaviors instead, because when I was doing it, I was mainly getting like random noise, but you could potentially enforce like a level of correlations between like various steps that might be better for finding convolutional or like kernels, which are better for creating solitons.
Hmm. Yeah, you should check it out. Check out NCA's. I don't think they've quite met their exact app, their killer app yet, in terms of what you can use them for, but might be useful to you to learn, to learn specific convolutions in the 2D case. But I
Cool.
just want to make sure everybody is sort of clear on sort of the basic principle of you have to run it in order to get the outcome, because that's the jumping off point for the things I've been thinking a lot about in relation to the language and the large language models and autoregression. There it is, first mention.
All right,
So
taking a hit right
autoregression.
quick. And then I gotta take
So
another one because I'm about to bring up coordination.
just to quickly kind of catch people up when we're talking. So the autoregressive models, uh, in a nutshell, any autoregressive model, basically what you're doing is you have some function, it takes in an input and it produces an output like any function. Um, and what makes what makes a process autoregressive, it's not really the function that's autoregressive, is that what you do is you take the output of the function and then you feed it back in recursively. And what you're doing, one reason it's autoregressive, is you're actually tacking on, you're taking the output and you're tacking on to the previous input, so that you're incrementally actually growing this sequence,
Compounding.
the input sequence. You're compounding, and you're doing it in such a way, in at least in the case of large language models, where the specific order of the sequence in which you generated it is gonna make a big difference. So for large language models in general, you put an input, you give it the cat sat, and then you're asking it to do next token generation, and you're saying, okay, given that sequence, what should you do next? What do you predict is next? That's the term that's usually used, prediction. I have some qualms with that, but we're not going to get into that, although it may be relevant to our conversation. But you say, what should come next? And the LLM says the cat sat. Oh, I'm going to cat sat on. And then it says, okay, now I've got a longer sequence. And the function remains static. The function is just a static function that says, given a sequence, what's the next token? And then you have this extra process. You say, okay, given that output, tag it on, and then feed it again. So the cat sat on, and then you feed that in again, and then it says, okay, well, now I think the next one should be and so on. And it could be the cat sat on the couch or the cat sat on the mat or something like that, and so on and so forth. And the magic of it is that that is sufficient. If you learn that function from a big corpus, you learn the function of just next token, and then you run it autoregressively. You do it this tack on and then feed it through again. You get the full behavior of the large language models like ChatGPT, such that it can basically do human language with a high degree of competency. And that's very surprising because it's only really doing this very next token. And it seems, and this is my broad argument, is that language itself, the corpus that these models learn to do next token from, the reason why it ends up solving language is because language itself is designed to be generated autoregressively. And what I mean by that is that the structure of language, the corpus that these language models learn from, the corpus itself contains the topology of the corpus, the relation between words within it, actually contains the predictive structure that tells you not only what the next token is going to be, but that next token is then going to be efficiently predictive of the next token and the next token. And so by guessing next token, really what you're doing is, and really what large language models are doing when they're learning, is they're learning these trajectories. They're learning these trajectories through this token embedding space. They're learning not really just to predict the next word the cat sat on, or the, right? The is not a particularly useful output. It's because the is anticipatory of the next word. Now, the function's not doing that, right? That's the crazy thing. That's the thing that's very hard to wrap your mind around, is that the function never learns to think about anything but the next token. It doesn't actually guess the thinking, hey, I'll bet there's another word coming after the. They simply don't have the capacity to do that because it's a single pass. And it's very equivalent to the cellular automata. It's just a row. And it's saying, here, given that row, what's the next row? And that's it. And that's all it learns. So neural or otherwise, right? In the cellular automata, standard cellular automata, those are fixed rules. Neural cellular automata, you could have learned rules. In the case of language, they are learned. They're not rules. But what is it's a little more complicated than that, but it's learned this embedding space where words are in relation to one another in this high dimensional embedding space. And given that, it's able to predict what's the next thing. And again, the magic is that even just given that limited guess, if you have sufficient training data and you're exposed to enough sequences, and the sequence can be very long, and then all you have to do is next token embedded within that, and I call it the pregnant present, the term I've been using. Just doing that very next step contains within it the kind of directionality of the longer trajectory. And so this very, very strongly reminds me of cellular automata. And I think it speaks deeply to a couple of things. That the nature of language, first of all, it seems to be built inherently to operate in this take the next step. But like cellular automata, don't worry. I got this. I'm doing one step forward, and you're like, but that's it? You can't see further than. No, and the answer is no, you can't. But there's sufficient information, predictive information, in the corpus such that prediction, that single prediction, is sufficient to plot out a much longer trajectory, right? So that you are actually going to get. You're not really just guessing next token. If you really just had to do that blindly, then you'd quickly run into a wall. Instead, what's happening is you've learned these trajectories through this space. And I don't mean you've learned specific trajectories. The cat sat on the mat. Okay, you've seen that exact thing before, right? The beauty of the extraordinary capacity of the large language models is that they can do novel generation, things that have tokens or token sequences that have never existed before. It's not that they've learned a particular trajectory. What they've learned is what's sort of an appropriate trajectory through this embedding space, whatever that means. This is something I'm actively working on a lot right now, is thinking about what does that mean, what an appropriate sort of trajectory actually means. But that's what they're doing. So I think we could take it at base level. They're doing something very similar to cellular automata. They are doing it's not a simple set of update rules. Instead, it's really a complex topology that they learn that allows them to do this prediction. Use this kind of a self-attention framework. But for all intents and purposes, that is essentially what they're doing. We could think of it, the rules aren't written down. The rules are embedded in the weights, kind of like neurocellular automata. But they are, in a sense, right? Like it's a static neural network, and the rules are static. The rules are like, they're not changing. What is changing is the context. What's changing is the context, namely the sequence. And as it's producing, it's changing the context. It's changing its own inputs. And then you're producing the outputs. Again, similar to cellular automata. The update rule says, here's what I've got, here's what's next. Now what's next is now fed into those same rules. And then you produce the next thing. And lo and behold, you get really surprising complexity. Now in the case of large language models, it's not just complexity you ended up with. It's not just even repetitive structure or noise, but it's this crazy thing we call language, which somehow maps and allows us to coordinate behavior and all of that good stuff that language does. But I think there's certainly some very fundamental similarities there that are first of all worth noting. I want to first point. I want to speak to the computational irreducibility, which certainly seems to hold in the case of large language models. And that is this idea, again, of the fundamentally autoregressive nature of language. If you train a model to guess 2 tokens out or 3 tokens out, it starts to do much more poorly. There seems to be this requirement almost, built into the structure of language that you can't do it that way. what has to happen is similar to cellular automata, you're not guessing the sixth line out. You can't do it from row 1 to row 6. You have to say, well, no, generate row 2 and then run the rules. And it's the same kind of process here that you can design a system that tries to do that, but it fails. These are incredibly powerful learning systems, big fat data centers the size of Manhattan, crunching through it. But if you try to say, well, guess 3, 4 tokens out, it doesn't do very well. It certainly does much more poorly than if you just do it autoregressively, which, by the way, is a pain in the neck. It's sort of an inherent bottleneck. It'd be great from the standpoint of speed if you could just say, boom, here's your prompt, here's your document, give me the summary instantaneously, right? Just do it in parallel using those wonderful GPUs, but that's not how it works. That's not how autoregressive systems work. You have to run it. You have to run it iteratively, which is an inherent bottleneck. And you can actually see it, right? The systems are getting faster and faster, just computes better, but you can still see them generating like this, right? And it's not because that looks cool, like old-fashioned, kind of like 70s kind of computers. That's how they would generate, but it's just how you have to do it. It has to literally generate in this iterative fashion. So this computational irreducibility seems to be kind of built in. There are techniques. So for example, how do you guess the next token? Well, you could just take the best one, the most highly predicted one, but that actually ends up very often getting into very uninteresting places. So really, what you get is a distribution, and you say, okay, amongst these, here's a certain k number of most likely tokens. I'm not just going to pick the next one. I'm going to do something. Maybe have a temperature is going to say. Sometimes I'm going to pick one that's a little less, not the most predicted. And that gets you more interesting things. But how do you actually choose? And so there's various techniques for doing this. It's like beam search. There's techniques where you say, well, let's see which one gets me to which is it. And we can think of these as sort of branches. And then I think they're called branches, and sort of branching trajectories. If the cat sat on the mat versus the cat sat on the couch versus the cat sat on the, and then right, there's 3 different possibility. Well, I said done all, whatever. But what happens next? And what you could do is run parallel autoregressive processes and say, okay, what happens this way and what happens that way? And there's techniques for saying, okay, given that there's 5 different branches, let's see what happens in each one. And then you see the log probs and you sort of collect them and see, okay, this one's a dead end. This one seems to go somewhere good. This one seems to go somewhere better. Let's go that way. And then you continue from there. So these are very actually inefficient ways to do it. Again, speaks to the inherent problem, the inherent autoregressiveness of it. It'd be great if you could say which of these paths should I take, because if you don't really want to spend that computational processing on exploring these different branches. But you have to do it. You have to do them iteratively and then come up with some selective process. So that's the first thing I want to mention, is that there seems to be this computational irreducibility that applies very strongly in the case of language, at least as we've seen from large language models. And I think that's very interesting and very fundamental, perhaps speaks not only to the nature of language, but maybe cognition more broadly. But I'll leave that for a little bit later. But this is how our brains, my contention is how our brains work, period. This is what cognition is, period. That we're doing this kind of neural next token, cognitive next token prediction, and then running from there. Instead of we don't have the capacity to sort of project out into the future in parallel. Suddenly we have to kind of run it. That's why when we imagine, what am I going to do after this talk, or how am I going to solve this problem? We kind of have to run it. When you see somebody sitting there and thinking, that's what they're doing. They're running an autoregressive process. They can't just produce the output of all the sequence steps immediately. So that's sort of kind of the first broad thing that I want to mention. That's I think very resonant with what's going on with these cellular automata. Number 2, the big thing that I've been thinking about here is where the large language models and where autoregression departs from cellular automata and other kinds of systems maybe that are like that. So ultimately, cellular automata are fundamentally Markovian. And what I mean by that is all you take into account. So you've got each row, and then you produce the next row from this row. And then when you're thinking about, okay, what am I going to do in row number 3, you only take into consideration what's happening in row number 2. Row number 2 is fully determining what's happening in row number 3. And it doesn't matter how you got to row number 2. It's irrelevant. You could have gotten there, right? I mean, maybe you could speak to this, Dugan. Like, if you take a very small little, maybe just 10 cells, and you start from with a certain configuration, you can end up in the same exact configuration with different starting configurations. Of course you can, because lots of them die, right? And if you just think about just having all empty cells, of course, there are many ways to get there. And so within a Markovian system, it's one way to think about literally what a Markovian system is. All you're thinking about, the next state of the system is only dependent on the previous state. It's only dependent, or I guess you could say the current state, and then some update rule. Autoregression is not like that. Autoregression is fundamentally not like that because the system cares about how you got there. The system is not only producing the next token, but it's tacking on that next token to a historical sequence. And the historical sequence matters. What happened up till this last token is critical, and how you got there is critical in the sense that the order in which the previous tokens led to this next token is what's driving that trajectory. The trajectory isn't just here's a bag of tokens, what should the next token be? It's a particular ordered sequence of tokens. And who produced that ordered sequence? The system itself, right? The function itself produced that ordered sequence. And then again, that's the autoregression aspect of it. And so what you have here is something that is much more computational potentially, and not to not throwing shade at cellular automata, but if you add that element of a memory of the previous states, in the case of language, we see that that's fundamental. We see that and it's probably inescapable. The reason why neural networks didn't work for a long time in order to do language is because they simply did input-output. People tried to do other kinds of memory state systems, recurrence, Hopfield, and then eventually LSTMs, which are pretty darn close to what large language models are doing, but they don't have the full context. LSTMs have this kind of compressed state history that captures some of what happened in the past, but not all of it. What the magic happens with large language models is when you get the full context, when you actually get the entire history to build off of. And so to me, this speaks to sort of something, there's some fundamental similarity. This computational irreducibility, I think, is very similar between the large language models and cellular automata. But in the case of large language models, and I would argue in the case of cognition more broadly, and maybe in other systems as well, it's a bigger, longer spiel. You need that memory. You can't do it in a Markovian way. Markovian systems are very efficient and very simple in some ways, and very, very powerful. A lot of physics the math is Markovian, but it may be the case that in some cases, and in the case of language, I think is the first one that we're seeing a very clear example, but other time series data, and probably in other kinds of biological processes, it might not be sufficient to be Markovian. So these are kind of my broad sort of entry thoughts into this relationship between the autoregressive language models and the cellular automata.
It can be made Markovian if you turn the temperature all the way down. Is that accurate? And you include the states,
no,
include the history. It's like,
well, you have to include the history. So
yeah.
That's kind of
You
right.
never
So
come
that's
back to the
inherently
same
not Markovian. So, yeah. So and it gets into a funny kind of thing where you think about what constitutes sort of the state of the environment. If you count the context as the state of the environment, then in theory you could say anything is Markovian. You just include the history, right, in the state. But that's cheating in a certain sense, because you have to encode that somehow, right? The idea behind a Markovian is that you've got a sort of this simple kind of you only have access to the sort of the current point in time. if you have a long, if you have a long memory, then and then you say that's part of the updated state, then anything could be Markovian. But
Right. So Markovian, just to review, is you have a finite number of states and some transitions between them, and you run a process going from one of those nodes, a finite set of nodes or states, I guess.
yes, exactly. Right,
Right.
exactly.
Okay.
And so, and as as you're progressing through those states, the history doesn't matter. But right, exactly. But when Markovian, the utility of it is that the state doesn't contain within it the entire history. It's just that it's fairly simply defined. And that's, in the case of cellular automata, well, the state in that case is just that particular state of the grid, which I think is sort of meant to be kind of like an environment. It's not exactly the system. It's kind of more like an environment. But even in that case, you don't think about, right? You don't there's no expression. The way you got there is not contained within that state of the grid, right? You could have any old set of paths that got you there. Whereas in the case of LLMs, everything is there. The entire history is there. You need it. You
Yeah.
need the entire history. You can't really compress it into the current state. It doesn't contain those.
But
There,
also
oh,
in
go
keeping
ahead.
track of that history, there's sort of I mean, the way I understand it, there's sort of a matrix that gets built up as you inject the system prompt, and then the sort of and as you start crunching out the output.
Yep.
I guess there are all these tokens that are involved in the prompt and the output and things related to that, and then there's this big matrix which gets built up, which is basically saying how much those ideas, those tokens, are related to each other.
Yep.
So when you have a matrix, you basically have a connection graph, a mind, like just this web essentially of
Yep.
related concepts. And so, and then there's some sort of attention head which says like, okay, we're looking at this part right now, and then we'll get to this other part next. But right now, it's like we need to figure out the word that best fills in this gap. To say like that is to say when we talk about when we produce language, we have like an idea of what we want to say as like a theme, um, as a plan, right? And then we go through one word at a time, trying to spit that out in a linear sequence.
Well, calling it a plan though is like it's a little anthropomorphizing, right? Because in the case of LLMs, there isn't really a plan in the conventional sense. It's
That's
just
what I'm
that
wondering, if there is embedded in that matrix or embedded somewhere
so
in the algorithm.
not so it depends what you mean by a plan. So there's no way there's no sense in which you can say that there's an explicit representation um, anything beyond the next token. But there is implicit representation of things beyond the next token, in the sense that the plotted trajectory and in the as the self attention and the weights that say how much should each word at each token attend to every other token. Implicit within that is the is the plan, and it's very hard to wrap your mind around it. I don't
Right.
have
Well,
this
especially
concept
if,
is.
I don't know. Yeah, you can have associations between tokens, and those associations can be directed such that you can have you can trace out paths in a directed graph, um,
Mhm.
form plans of attack, let's say, or plans of what you want to talk about in a
Right,
sequence.
right. I see what you're saying. Right. I mean, in a certain sense, right, the graph structure sort of it certainly contains implicitly within it that if this shows up, right, there's sort of I call them potentialities, right? Like and it's all embedded. It's all just in the static structure. I mean, there's sort of, if I were to give you this, then this is what you should do. And so and so that's sort of implicit within it, right? And so in other words, when it's producing its next token, and then it's going to have to guess the next token based on that, it's already in there, in some sense, right? it's not doing anything new. It's not thinking new thoughts that it didn't have before. All the thoughts are in there, and that's one way I like to think about it, is that like all of the, and it relates to something Daniel and I kind of argue about sometimes and discuss, right? That the knowledge is sort of in there, but and yet it's not, right? There's no sequence. If you look at the weights of the actual model, there isn't a sequence actually in there. You can't find a sequence, but what you can find is these probabilities, these transition probabilities, that if this sequence were to be there, was as an input, then what would it do next? And then, of course, based on what it does next, it also has the probabilities of what it would do henceforth. And so but the sequence is in there only in this generative sense, only in that if you were to run it and to do it autoregressively and to feed it its own, then this is what will happen. And it's all in there, right? Like the answer to all these different questions, questions that nobody's ever asked, are in the weights, so to speak, but in this indirect way, and not really, it's not as simple as thinking of the graph structure, that you could read off the graph structure and find your answer to stuff. That's almost like saying we can look at the rules of a cellular automaton, and reading that off, we can say what's going to happen. No, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
The
Depends
graph
on the
structure
initial
is.
condition.
It depends on the initial condition. But what's crazy is that the initial, but the conditions are right. Okay, call it the initial conditions, but it's the context is constantly changing based on its own output, just like cellular automata. And it depends what's going to happen in row 6 as well. It's going to happen. It depends on what happens in row 5. I can compute that for you, but I can't get you that directly from the graph. No matter how sophisticated your analysis of that graph, you're not really going to be able to say what this thing knows, what its beliefs are, what it's going to produce, given a certain sequence. So I think really that yes, there's some sense in which it's in there, but not in the sense any more simple than like in cellular automata, besides like it will produce that. And so yes, the planning is sort of implicit. It's inherent in the weights, but it's never actually planning, right? I think that's what's very clear. Even if you try to decode some of the activations, and there's some cool stuff out of Anthropic that I'm still chewing on. I think the world is still chewing on exactly what it means, where they did this kind of decoding, showing that certain kind of activations within the distributed weights seem to be decodable as some of the some tokens that come later on, which looks like it's thinking about those things later on, but that's not really probably the right way to look at it, because there isn't
Saying
a
it only
thought
starts
process
thinking about
here.
those things once it gets there.
It can't think about it beforehand, and because there's no such thing as these things thinking. It's just a forward pass. There isn't any sense in which that particular distribution of nodes means that thing until you get to generation. The generative step is fundamentally different than the pass through. So this is a little bit. I think this may be a little contentious. Even I think some people might interpret it that way, but I think they're wrong, because it's just a forward pass. There isn't there's no thinking happening there in words. The words only happen at this sort of the terminal step, where it's like, okay, here's my my output. There aren't words happening in the earlier layers that you could think of as like the thought process. That's kind of a mistaken way to think about it, like a sequential thought process.
So
So
yeah, I
they're not
mean,
really
given the
planning.
system prompt, like what color is the sky and why, like I wonder at what point does the token for Rayleigh scattering start getting into the mix? If it happens before it says that the sky is blue, and then starts
Yeah, these are
talking
great
about
questions. Great
Yeah.
questions. Whether you can sort of spot something, I call it a ghost of the future, right? That there's something that is in the trajectory that is anticipatory, that is going to lead you to that, to the specific phrase, and it's going to get there, and it's somehow it is baked in some ways to that. That's a good trajectory to go on and end up there, but it's not thinking that thought in the way that we do. So you don't want to be anthropomorphizing. We're like, well, I'm thinking in my head, I have to talk about this kind of scattering or whatever, but you're doing that aggressively. Like those tokens are actually playing in your head.
When I make the
It
plan, it's autoregressive in its own right. Like I have this big like pie in the sky plan of action.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. It's
what do I
autoregressive
want to do? I
utility.
want to talk about the blueness and then talk about the physics. And then I start, making a detailed sentence about that one word at a time.
I was
Right.
I mean,
I actually want to mention, I
yeah, sorry,
think
Dan, you've had your hand up for a while. Go ahead.
no,
Sorry,
no, no.
Dugan.
I have something in particular, and then I have something else I was going to comment on. But I was going to say, Dugan, I think it's important to distinguish here what you're talking about, where you have a rough idea of the whole thing, and then you get into finer and finer detail, is diffusion and not
Mm.
auto-regression. Those are sort of two different things. Um,
Maybe.
maybe, but sort of there's two processes here. Auto-regression is when I'm sort of generating the next piece at sort of the highest granularity, I would say. So the token level is the token is less than a word usually. Um, and then diffusion, and by the way, there's also language models that work diffusively. But diffusion is where I sort of generate things at a high level and I sort of put some basic ideas in place. It's kind of like how you build a house. I build a frame and then I slowly fill in more and more detail. And then by the end, I'm moving in furniture and putting this dish here and that dish here, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, right. But you're one person, so you make the frame one nail at a time. In a sort of auto-regressive fashion.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
Maybe. I mean,
And
and
yeah, I
these
mean,
are open
yeah,
questions.
like, am I diffusing the plan one thought at a time? Like, I wonder how much of the I have two things that I want to say about the sky being blue and the science behind it. Does that does it come into my mind at the same moment? And then I crystallize one at a time and then make sentences later. I keep going back and forth on this.
Yeah, no,
I
it's
mean,
very introspection
often,
is probably not a good tool here
oh
because the
no,
introspection because we're introspecting on our introspection and we're doing it using the same tools that we do to do the thinking in the first place, and so it's hard to know, and you might start losing your mind if you think. But I think there's definitely very big open questions about even for language. I mean, it's my contention is that human language, like LLMs, the current state of the art is autoregressive, but there are models that do it that do pretty well, although not as well using the same computational horsepower. Do it diffusion wise, which you sketch out sort of whatever it means to sketch out. It's kind of funny in the case of language because with it's easier with images. With images, it's you sort of get this idea of doing sort of a coarse, low spatial frequency kind of version, and if you watch the diffusion models, you can see it happening. Like here's sort of the coarse structure, and then you further refine, and you're doing it in parallel everywhere. In the case of language, what is the coarse structure of language, such that they're doing it? I actually looked into this, but I don't remember the answer to that anymore. Exactly how the diffusion models think about language in this course defined way. I think maybe they're just guessing. Are they guessing just words, masked words? I think that's what they're doing. Where there's words and then there's non, and then there's mask, and then there's words and then there's mask and things like that. And then they're slowly filling in like Sudoku style what those other words would be or something like that. And they're doing it, but they're doing it iteratively. But I just should mention that even diffusion happens iteratively. It's not, again, similar to cellular automata. With diffusion, you don't just do boom, there's your answer. You produce a sort of first little, course sketch, you can like the frame, and then you build on that, and you're doing it based on your output. Then you run it through again, and you keep doing it, stepwise. And so all of these models, diffusion or autoregression, have this built-in stepwise kind of component to them that seems to be really fundamental to certain kinds of complex computation. And so that, to me, that's just speak. I think it really does speak to something deep about not just the brain, but about sort of the nature itself. That certain kinds of computations that are distributed and complex enough you can't solve them closed form. You're not going to be able to do that in like just in one fell swoop and say, here's your solution. That's a very, very narrow range of kinds of problems that you can do where you can really do it and say, here's what the arc of this this function, here's what it's going to look like at every point, without running something and doing it iteratively. In the real world, it's much closer to cellular automata, and in real cognition, it's more similar. You really you have to run it. There are no shortcuts. So even diffusion, it's not a shortcut. You can't just go straight to image. You straight to the final image. You have to do it iteratively, even if it's not autoregressive in the sense like you're guessing lots of stuff from different places rather than saying just next token. But you're still doing it in this iterative way.
I I think it's worth mentioning in reference to sort of this conversation about diffusion versus autoregression and a mixture between them. There's at least one company I know of, and I don't know how successful they are with it because they haven't released
Hmm.
anything publicly, but there's at least one company I know of that is working on block diffusion, where you take a block of text, and so you say, here's 10 tokens, and then we're going to do diffusion within those tokens, and then we're going to do the next 10 tokens, something like this. And reportedly, they're getting some really major efficiency gains in terms of
Interesting.
computation by doing things that way.
Right. Interesting. And even if human language is autoregressive, that doesn't mean it's the most efficient way to fundamentally do it. It could be that it's the best way we can do it using our particular brain structure. And this gets to my broader, the broader framework, which is I think the brain is fundamentally autoregressive in the sense that it could only sort of do one clock, basically one flop at a time, and then feed off of its own output. And so maybe that's how humans do language, and maybe why language has the particular kind of predictive structure it has. But there may be shortcuts, and I'm not. I have I do predict that you're never going to be able to do diffusion in a very long range fashion that's going to be as effective as auto regression, but I may be wrong. But I
I mean,
certainly could be
so it's
wrong
like
at
there's
some
a
level.
limitation of we can only crystallize one thought at a time, typically. I
That's how
think
our brain seems to work, right?
but
That
I
and
mean, again, I don't know if that's totally true. I mean, in what sense do you think a thought and then three other related thoughts like kind of spring up from the bottom? Uh,
but then you choose one and you run with it.
right,
You can't
right. But
really
in what
run different thoughts in parallel. Or
yeah,
guess 10 steps out, 10 steps out ahead. Like I don't know. You know what I like I don't know. Does anybody know really good chess players? Like, they have to think many moves ahead. Do they do that sequentially in their head? Like, is the experience of it like that they kind of run through quickly all the different scenarios, or do they see ahead? Like, can they just skip in some ways without having to run those intervening steps? And and,
What happens
and
a lot
chess
of
is just one
times
example.
in like strategic choices is that you're kind of just thinking about it and then it kind of pops up. Perceptually, that's one of the things that happens is just you're thinking about something and then it pops up. And then, there's
I mean,
kinds
like
of
sudden
multiple
insight.
ways of doing this, right? There's, you're actually literally piecing each thing one to one, adding them up, visually mapping it out in your head or whatever. And then the alternative is you're just kind of like, it's just, you're kind of just slightly more passive, or dare I say it's something kind of, below the conscious, whatever people like to attribute
Hmm.
that to. And the answer
Hmm.
just kind of pops up in your mind. Almost like it comes out of nowhere. That's what
Yeah, the
happens a
eureka
lot of time.
moment, those things, right? Like the
Bingo.
famous kind of eureka moment. And so, well, here's is that because there was underlying subconscious, maybe iterative, even autoregressive processing, and then it just didn't make its way into awareness, or is that really a fundamentally different thing? Because maybe there are completely different ways of doing neural computation. Sometimes they don't have to be sequential in this way, and maybe there it just appears the same way, like when you recognize somebody's face or certain kinds of basic perceptual understanding. You don't have to do it sequentially. You just do it. It's a single pass. And so I think that's a really great question, is whether um, do we have like other parallel but autoregressive or at least iterative processes that are running that are outside of awareness? Um,
I would I
I
would say yeah. I would say
you would
that
say
like
yes.
the association of memory, you think about a thought, you bring it into your attention, and then some other associated thoughts spring up from the depths. And that's sort of a process that happens somewhere in our brain, but outside of our main
Are those, I guess,
realm
but
of
are those,
attention.
Alon, I got one
are
more
those
example
thoughts?
actually.
Sorry, yeah, what you got?
Yeah. I was gonna say, the other thing that I've also kind of experimented with is like, if you are very sleep deprived or you're inebriated in some kind of
I know
state
somebody who knows
and
about that.
your working memory is kind of shot, right? Your working memory, whatever, and you can't necessarily keep, those so-called slots in your head and think about things in that super active way. If you're still trying to solve a similarly complex problem, if you go at it long enough, you don't actually get access to that so-called working memory, but you have this weird thing where the answer starts to pop into your head. Now, some people would say this is like some intuition kind of thing or some subconscious thing, whatever word you want to describe it fine. But the particular thing that's happening that's strange is that you can kind of gnaw off this thing that we consider pretty important for decision making and cognition, and you can still achieve the same goal by very different means. In
Right,
other
and
words, you don't even need that typical perceptual experience of working memory chunks to still solve the problem if you go at it enough. Like it's like the mind is trying to, it's the same goal, different means, right? And I think what happens, and some of you have maybe experimented with this before, is that if your work memory is shot and you have this very complicated, logic puzzle or thing that you're trying to build or whatever, is because you can kind of no longer force yourself to like chunk each individual slice and try to piece it together. Your brain is trying to find another way to solve that goal. And I think this is one of the ways that it does it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to me that makes a ton of sense. And one way to think about this dichotomy maybe is that working memory is the iterative workspace. I would call it autoregressive, but even if it's not autoregressive, let's
Interesting.
even if
Yeah.
it's diffusion, whatever. And then there are other ways to solve certain kinds of problems that don't require that. And I guess right, that's sort of the big question in my mind is maybe that's just maybe it's doing the same, maybe your brain's doing the same kind of thing just outside of awareness. And it really is kind of slogging through, but you just don't experience it. Or maybe it's a fundamentally different way of solving stuff, more similar to just visual recognition, template matching, just one pass through. Here's the solution, and as opposed to having to do this kind of iterative thing. So I think that's like a very deep, important question about the nature of like conscious awareness and the what we think, sort of conscious workspace. Is that the unique place where we do this kind of iterative processing and everything else is happening fundamentally differently? Or maybe there are offline similar kinds of processes. One thing I want to mention is that I've brought this up a few times, is that I often find music, I can have a tune in my head. I've been doing other stuff, having a conversation. It's not happening right now, I'm noticing, by the way, but usually very often it's happening during my day. But I can be typing, thinking linguistically, maybe even, listening to somebody else talk. And then there's this other sequential process, and it's iterative, right? It has to run. It's not just like a boom, one and done kind of thing. And it's happening clearly to me. It's pretty clear, like introspectively, it's happening in parallel. So that to me says, well, maybe you can have parallel processes that are actually doing this kind of iterative thing happening in parallel. So maybe it's not only the central kind of workspace that does this kind of iterative processing, but maybe music's special. I don't know. Maybe music's just a weird example that it can run so easily in our brains, and maybe we can't think about. I guess one way to think, can we think without being aware of it? Is one way to think about it. Because I think the word thinking is sort of gets at this notion, right? We all know what thinking is. It's you're sitting there and you're doing something. It's sequential inherently, right? Recognizing is not thinking. Certain things you could solve immediately. That's not thinking. Thinking is when you got to spend time. What do you mean you got to spend time? It's you could think of it as diffusing, or you could think of it as autoregressing. But either way, you're taking a step, and then you're saying, okay, from here, I'm going to do the next step. That's thinking, right? Does that happen outside of conscious awareness, or is the only kind of thinking that I have this theory that it's just conscious awareness, only in conscious music is a problem for my theory, but you're kind of aware of music, right? So my theory is that is what consciousness is. Consciousness is the iterative kind of process where you have to produce and then take your own production and then feed it in again. That's maybe even why it has this subjective quality, but that's going a little too far. But what do you guys
Yeah,
think?
I was
Can
gonna
you
say I think
think?
David Chalmers is out of a job now.
Yeah, he's done. Sorry, man. Hang up the bomber jacket. It's time. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think you think offline, or do you think you just spontaneously sort of have intuition offline, but it's not really thinking?
Well,
Do you have an
so
intuition
you know,
about that?
there's plenty of thinking that happens automatically sometimes, especially for tasks that you've already mastered. You know, musicians will have muscle memory, or
Yep.
you know, you're driving, you're not concentrating on driving, you're just sort of doing it and thinking about other things. Basically, what you're thinking about is sort of what you need to figure out that's hard, that you haven't figured out before, right? You're trying to like
Hmm.
figure something out.
But
So
is that thinking?
you're
Is
putting
that thinking
your
like
attention.
driving? Is driving thinking? Because you don't have to, because you're just like you're responding to the current stimulus response.
Right,
It's
right. I'm not
that.
thinking about the song that's in my head.
But
It's
what's your definition of thinking? You know, when you're asking that question, in order for me
Mhm.
to answer, I would like to know what's your definition of thinking.
I mean, well, I was kind of hoping for people's own intuition about it. I define thinking as any sort of cognitive process that has to happen over time sequentially. That's what I call thinking. Meaning you don't get, it's not just a single input output. It's that you have to actually go through various steps internally in order to solve a problem. That's kind of my working definition of
But
thinking.
I mean, you always go through them internally. Like if you, I'm gonna give a really stupid, trivial example. If you're watching a movie that you're really interested in, and at the same time you're playing a solitaire, is either one
Okay.
of them thinking in your world? I'm a little confused.
That's a good question. So solitaire, I would say you don't necessarily, if you can solve it, if you can do the pro, if you can do it with a single stimulus response kind of one pass through, then I wouldn't call it thinking. Like, I don't know, a simple example.
So
If I throw something at you, you have to catch it.
if you're watching a documentary or whatever, or podcast, something that still requires, some brain activity. I don't know if you call it
It
thinking or
certainly
not.
requires brain activity. I mean, all of these require brain activity.
I'm
But
just, I'm
yeah,
looking
yeah.
for words when I'm talking to you. So if is watching a documentary thinking?
I would say in order to process language, like in a documentary or a sequence like that, uh, I think that does require thinking.
Okay.
Because
And then
I would say it depends on where your attention mechanism is focused. And you
what
can
do you
play
mean?
solitaire sort of in the background of your mind a little bit, even though you're looking at it, but it's like if you're focused on the
I think
documentary,
you can see the
trying to
current
get
state
more
of the
attention.
solitaire, and you're like, I know what to do. I'm so good at solitaire. I'm like, given this state, I just know to do this. And there really isn't anything, it's not multi-step. Whereas watching a documentary, even though you're not doing anything but in order to comprehend it, you have to take sequence into account. So it's a great question whether that counts as thinking.
all
Is
right,
watching
so
TV thinking?
let me trivialize it even more. If I were
Okay.
to having this conversation with you and at the same time playing bridge.
Maybe you are, right? You're off camera, so for all we know.
Exactly. It's actually true.
No wonder you thought of it. Okay. Well, you're in a
So
great position.
which one is thinking and which one is not? Like I'm trying to, since you won't give me the definition, I'm trying to use binomial method to figure out what when you say thinking, what do you mean by it?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I do have something of a working definition. Let's leave viewing. Uh, okay. Anytime. So is talking thinking is actually I haven't really thought about that, but I'm talking about thinking. When you are running operations in your mind in order to solve a problem and it requires a sequence of steps, that's what I call thinking. Um, and I think that that has
So
to happen sort
so
of
let's say we
iteratively.
have this conversation now, and then we go offline, and an hour later, I have a thought that would answer some of your question or define thinking. At the same time, while I was doing something where requires sequential thinking.
Were you
Does that?
thinking about the conversation? Were you kind of replaying it in your head and thinking about it in order
No,
before
no,
you came
not
up
at
with
all. Not at all. It just came up.
it just pops into your mind?
It never happens to
wait,
you?
no, I think that definitely does happen to me. And so this is where you would get into this fundamental question. Like, was that because your brain was actually playing the conversation outside of awareness, and then that led you to
Yes.
this insight? Or
Yes.
is it really something different so by my definition of thinking, I don't know, I would say but it's an empirical question. My definition of thinking is that if you were playing the conversation in your head in order to,
No, if you're not
no,
playing it. If you play and I'm clear on. If you're not playing it, that's where I get very confused. Have you ever like look at the code and you couldn't see the bug and then you couldn't hold it anymore and you had to go to the bathroom and you came back from the bathroom and you look
and
at this code,
the
it's right
Tunnel
there.
vision. Tunnel vision. Yes, exactly.
yes,
So
and that
again,
eureka.
you need to tell me in all those little examples and make as stupid as they are, where do you consider thinking and where do you not consider thinking? And so I'm sorry.
Okay, so no. This is very fair. And so I think maybe we could leave the word thinking aside for a second, because that's just like, is this that? And just say, here's what I'm proposing. I'm proposing that there are certain kinds of cognitive processes, like language, um, and I think certain kinds of planning and reasoning about the future and things like that that require sequential processing, that you have to do things kind of iteratively. And then there are others that don't, like recognition. There's certain kinds of things that clearly do not require anything like that kind of sequential processing. Now, the question is, when you talk about these kind of sudden insights, which kind is that? Right? So forget about the word thinking for a second, but let's just think about, and in the case of like the beautiful thing about large language models is we could say that is autoregressive. It requires this sequential processing. It's mathematically defined in some ways as having this sequentiality built into it. Now, but when you're giving me a specific example, when you suddenly have some insight, then I think that's an empirical question. That was there offline sequential processing happening that you just weren't aware of? Or is it a totally different thing that's not sequential processing at all? Is it closer, maybe closer to like parallel diffusion, something like that, that's just happening in one step? So I think that maybe that crystallizes things instead of getting bogged down in the question of what constitutes thinking or not. We could talk about things that certain kinds of cognitive functions that require sequential processing and some that don't.
Can I
And
throw
then we could,
another edge case at
yeah.
you?
Yeah. Please,
So
I'm loving it.
sorry, but there are two other people holding hands and I didn't even raise it, so I feel a little bad, but it's real quick. Have you ever had at a party or whatever, at a meeting, saw somebody and they say, we've met before, but I don't remember. And then you were talking about other things or other people, not related to any of this person. And all of a sudden you remembered
Yeah.
how you knew that person. Sometimes it happens because something was mentioned, but I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about none of it was mentioned, none of it
Yeah.
triggered. There was no triggers. It just came up. Is
Yeah, I
that
think so. I think your question is what the hell is that? And I think that's a really good question. And I don't know if I don't really have that much to say about it, but I would at least say that there are two possibilities there, right? That you kept thinking about it without realizing. You kept thinking like you were running some search or running some sort of autoregressive process, like, okay, that person, when would I might have seen them, and running through things in your mind. Or there's some other thing that happens underneath the hood that isn't anything like sequential think or even search. It's kind of like tip of the tongue, right? Tip of the tongue, like what's the name of that actor who was in I don't know, whatever, I don't know, no, I don't know movies, but I can't come up with a movie. I don't know,
exactly?
Star Wars, right? I can't, and you're like, what is that name? And you're like thinking, and the truth is, your thought process that feels sequential, but that's not even what gives you the answer in the end. It comes out of nowhere, and it's like, boom! Where the hell did that come from? And so I think there's a really interesting empirical question of like, is there offline thinking that's kind of like the kind we do online, or is there some other kind of thing entirely? And I don't think we know enough at all about any of this stuff to be able to have really a substantive answer to that. But these are I think the right, these are perfect questions to ask in relation to what I'm claiming, because what I'm claiming is that autoregression is sort of very fundamental, at least to certain kinds of thought processes, iterative. And then the question is, well, how many? Is it like the recipe for almost all thinking? In which case you'd have to say that we're doing it offline because you're surely not aware of it, right? You're not thinking about that person. You stopped thinking about it a while ago. You're having a totally different conversation. Then you're like, oh, I remember where I can't remember them from. And like, what was that? Right? So was that a sequential processing or was it actually nothing like it, something completely different? So I think these are great questions. All right, there are people with their hands raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something that seems very relevant, which is that some of you might know Susan Schneider. I have a Susan Schneider on my shoulder right now screaming in my ear about global workspace theory. But I think global workspace theory really is fascinating. I've done some reading about it, and essentially it's this idea that your brain has many parallel processes going on at any given time. And consciousness is sort of an integration or filtering of those processes. So it's either saying we're going to put this and this together and make them sort of a cohesive whole. So I'm hearing and talking to a person at the same time, but we're going to integrate across those sensations. Or it's a filtering. So it's saying there's all these different thoughts going on, but this one is the most relevant to my situation. So I'm going to be consciously aware of this one. And it's one of the now it's only a soft theory of consciousness, but quite frankly, I like those better because those are more empirical. And as far as empirical support, it has quite a bit in terms of the way the prefrontal cortex works. So I guess in this sort of discussion about you're doing something and then a thought pops into your head, global workspace theory and some of our evidence about the prefrontal cortex would seem to imply that your brain was chugging away on that thought and processing it, but it just didn't see fit to bring your attention to it until it was done with the processing.
And what in global workspace, so is it a quantitative or a qualitative shift? Like what makes the thing that's in attention in consciousness, like what does it mean that it's in consciousness? Besides that, we can report on it. Like what is the reportability the whole thing, or is it like no, it's a qualitatively different kind of computation that's happening in awareness versus what's happening outside?
As far as I know, so there's sort of two branches of global workspace theory. There's the philosophers who are taking it off in all sorts of different directions and coming up with all sorts of ideas. And then there's the neuroscientists who are saying, okay, maybe this is a real theory of how attention in the brain works and how reportable experience or conscious experience works and why it has some of the mysteries that it does. And I've mostly read from the neuroscientists. So they're mostly interested in reportability because that's what you can empirically
Yep.
measure most of the time. Um, and typically the studies say, all right, there's all these thoughts going on in the brain, and we can sort of trace this signal here and this signal here. And it seems like someone attention was on this signal over here, but all of a sudden their attention moves on to this signal over here. And we can see that. And we can see that there's been some processing in this signal over here that's important, but the person wasn't consciously aware of that processing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was cheating a little bit. I actually asked Bernie Bars this very question, and he said at the time, and there was a little bit of a gasp in the room. I remember Scott Kelso and I both were like, "What?" He said, "He means reportability and nothing else. That's what he means by consciousness in his theory." Now, I think that's a very limited notion of consciousness because there's so much of this about the quality of consciousness that isn't inherently reportable. But I do want to point out that reportability sounds an awful lot like what? Language, right? It's language. And I wonder to what extent that may even be synonymous with what it is that he's proposing is that it goes into the autoregressive linguistic stream. That's what it means to be conscious of something, is that it ends up in that stream such that you're able to talk about it. But it's a very narrow notion of consciousness, that it's reportable. It means available to language, for the most part. I mean, although you could probably gesture at it too, I guess. So I don't know. I don't know if people are I was surprised by that. I don't know if that matches people's intuitions about what consciousness is, but if we just accept sort of reportability, then I guess that would be sort of the hard and even empirical, right? It's like a functional distinction of what you mean. It's not like not fuzzy stuff. It's like what can people say is going on or not. And right in the case of I don't know her name, but when she was asking about the party, um, there's no awareness of thinking about who that person was, who you kind of recognized. It's outside of awareness, and then boom, you get the answer to the question, right? And in the global workspace theory, you'd say, yeah, it's a similar thing as if you were thinking about it. It's just you didn't. It's not reportable, right? You just didn't have the ability to say it. I don't know how fundamental the distinction of reportability is. I don't know if people, if it matches people's intuitions about awareness.
Well, I'll just say from what I've read in the field, most of the sort of neuroscientific global workspace theory stuff, almost all that I read, it's been linguistically reportable. So you might be onto
Mm,
something there.
yeah.
I actually want to go do some digging now to see if I can find anyone who's doing things with like gestures or eye tracking or anything like that. That would be really interesting because now that I'm thinking about it, you're absolutely right. Everything that I've read has almost exclusively been linguistically reportable.
Yeah, eye tracking there's a lot of eye tracking though is subconscious, so to speak. It's like it's outside of it's what do you call it? Involuntary. There isn't really even a sense that it's under voluntary control, unlike if you say gesture or something like that. Um, yeah, but it's an important point, something I've been meaning to think about a lot. This reportability issue and its relation to language. I think there
So,
probably is something really important there.
so I'm curious, and then I'll pass the floor to Michael. But I'm curious mostly from my own literature search. What would you say is a measure of reportability in humans um, that isn't linguistic? Would you say that gesturing is non-linguistic, or would you say that even that is linguistic in some way?
Mm. It seems like to me, it seems pretty obvious that when you're gesturing, what you're really doing is you really want to say it, and you're just using that as a replacement for our normal language. So it seems like a pretty poor way of evading. Like, show me a case where you can gesture, but where you wouldn't be able to say it, right?
Mm.
Like that's never going to happen. You could just as well say it, but you happen to be gesturing. Like what you really want is something where it's not linguistically reportable, but you would still say there's awareness of it in some conscious way. Now, I think there's plenty of that in the sense like there's lots to conscious awareness that's not reportable. Like there are all kinds of when you open your eyes, you see the richness of a visual scene, and you can't describe it. And so I would say that's not reportable, and yet it is part of conscious awareness. And you could say things about it, you could try, but honestly, overwhelmingly, you can't really report it. And that's why I feel like it's like not quite the thing you really want when you talk about conscious awareness. Um, but you can at least talk about that you can't describe it, So like there's a certain degree of reportability to it. But that's very hard to measure, right? How do you measure empirically like the things you're aware of, but that you can't quite report, but you're still aware of them, right? You get to this
Yeah, I guess
bottleneck
that's
of
the.
empirical bottleneck.
I think that's a less philosophical question I'm asking as a scientist is how do you measure something in humans that isn't reportable, but there's still awareness of? Like, had
Well, then the
that
word
Venn
awareness though
diagram
is
of
vague.
aware but
Awareness is
non-reportable,
vague.
how do you measure that?
Awareness is vague. So like, well, let's talk about just like functionally, behaviorally relevant. You can definitely find people responding. You can measure their behavioral measurements that where they won't necessarily report. When somebody's driving or something like, and they'll turn or something like they don't necessarily wouldn't report on the curve of the road or things like that, but they are behaviorally responding to it in a certain sense. I think there's probably many such examples. It's hard to think of them right off the bat. Maybe people have some ideas of things where you would say that they're not necessarily going to be able to report on it, but you can see it's behaviorally there. And I mean, I think catching a ball or something like you really can't report on the phenomena in a way that tells you how you're picking up your hand, right? We don't really have insight into how to ride a bike, right? All procedural kind of stuff. Generally procedural cognitive abilities. We don't really have reportability. We don't have access reportable from a declarative standpoint as to what we're doing, but we know how to do it, and we're doing it, and it's whether it's awareness or not, we're doing it sort of outside of reportability. So I don't think that they're synonymous with one another. And I think you can measure them. I think you can measure stuff that's not reportable that still has behavioral consequences. I think
Not
Michael's
to
got.
interrupt you, but I think what you're talking about is muscle memory.
Yeah, we can call it that. But it's not just muscle, right? It's perception action memory. It's like much more complicated than just how to move your hands. It's how to move your hand in response to this particular environmental stimulus. And that's rich stuff. It's not just like a sequence that you've memorized or something. I don't know what you mean by muscle memory exactly, but sometimes people think of it as, it's just kind of like a sequence of muscle movements, but it's responsive to the
Like
environment. And so
surfing.
it's yeah, like
What I
surfing.
mean by muscle memory is sometimes when you can't remember how to do something and then you do it, and then as you're doing it, you verbalize it in your head or you speak it out or whatever. That's what I mean by
Right.
muscle memory. Something you
Right.
remember.
Like how do you ride a bike? Well, if you really want to tell somebody how to do it, the best way is you get on a bike first and then observe what you're doing and then try to describe it to them. Because if you think
Right,
about it in your head, you're probably going to get it wrong.
right, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely,
That's what I mean
absolutely.
by muscle memory. The one that has not been in your memory through verbalization, but in your memory through the muscles.
Right. Right. So do you think that you can have sort of cognitive, you maybe even call it awareness, where you're doing certain things like that, like procedural stuff, where we wouldn't say you can report it. Like it's not really accessible to language.
I don't think it's not accessible to language. I just think we didn't bother to convert because we had no need to convert until we do. Just
Mhm.
like riding a bike,
You can
you
do
know?
it. So it's there if you want it, but it's not really, it hasn't been done
Well,
before. It hasn't been encoded linguistically.
it's there if you want it or not. I will argue that muscle memory is not under your control. It's
Mm,
there. What you want it or not is a conversion into verbalization so you can pass it to another human.
right. I mean, it's actually a perfect example of the kind of input output, the way thinking about the brain in terms of input output as opposed to knowledge that what you learn when you know how to ride a bike, it's not like you know how to ride a bike. It's that you know what to do when faced with a particular configuration of your body and this object, you know what to do because that's the input and the output is to the correct behavior. The knowledge isn't really there. I think the same thing is true for linguistically encoded knowledge. But there's right, it's very different than you know what to do.
I
You
will
don't really
argue
know what
that
to do.
that the knowledge is there. It's just not there in a verbal form because we haven't converted. We had no need or desire to convert it to a verbal form. But it doesn't mean that the knowledge is not there, right?
Well, but the knowledge is encoded in terms of stimulus response,
It
not so
no, the
much.
knowledge is encoded as a muscle memory, and that's why I said it. That's why I called it muscle memory. If I ask you to jump over a small fence, you know how to do it, but you would
Mm,
not. It would take you longer to verbalize it than to go ahead and jump it, and then verbalize it. It would still be shorter because you just reminded yourself. You just verbalize it as you were doing it.
Well, you got me thinking a lot about like what's the nature of sort of this muscle memory because even there, maybe it's like okay, given the prompt to jump over this fence and given the current visual stimulus and your body's proprioception, there's a sequence of things you're going to do the next thing, which is you're going to crouch down, and then your body knows what to do from there. But maybe you don't really know what to do. Maybe your muscles don't really have the
No,
memory.
no,
Maybe
no.
they have
You
the
do
program.
know. You know it in nonverbal form, which is why I keep calling it muscle memory.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you, and then say
Okay.
that's not really memory in the traditional sense. It's more that you've just got you've got the input output. It's kind of similar again to sort of my idea on other kinds of memory, like even verbal memory. What you've got is the brain is ready. that given this input, here's the next output. But it may not have the entire sequence sort of actually programmed
And,
in.
and I will tell you why I will disagree with you
Tell me
that
why
you
I'm
would
wrong. Yes.
you do have entire sequence, because most people would know if they can jump this high of a fence or not.
Mm.
So it's somewhere there, right? You would not attempt to jump higher than you can. Like even if you're standing on something and you're trying to jump down, you kind of know what you can and how high and how not
Interesting.
high you can do, right? When you need to
And when you're
stop.
standing there, don't you kind of like almost you imagine, but you don't you kind of imagine the sequence and you're like,
I'm
can you
not
picture
able to
yourself?
imagine. I have aphantasia, so I cannot
Oh,
imagine.
wow. But you still know whether to jump over that, whether you can jump over that fence or not. And
Exactly.
good point. Good point. I like that. So, because
Sorry,
I was going to say, yeah, you just kind of run the sequence and you picture yourself falling flat on your face and you're like, I'm not going to do that. And you're kind of running it. But you're saying, no,
I'm not
you
able to
just
do
have
that.
this. Hmm. Yeah. Interesting. I have to think about that. I have to think about that. That's a great point.
Do we have any other questions, Michael Ostroff?
Yeah, I do. So when you were talking about autoregression, it kind of sounded to me that autoregression is basically doing a computation in steps where you have like a state and then using that state you get the next state and so on and so forth. And that made me start thinking about Turing machines. And now
Sure.
I'm kind of thinking that Turing machines are just like autoregressive. And if Turing machines are like universal, like computation wise, shouldn't all shouldn't computer programs in general be like autoregressive? I mean, you could have something like you could have like a normal computer program, or you could have something like like two vectors of like binary numbers, and you're like XORing like all the components together. In which case, the order that you do the operations in doesn't really matter because you're going to get the same thing in the end. So maybe that could be considered not autoregressive.
Well, yeah, no,
I don't know.
I think that's the critical distinction is that the Turing tape, it's kind of like your cellular automata. The state of the Turing tape at the time that you're doing that operation, um, it doesn't matter how you got there, and it only matters actually really about the very local operation that you're doing. The rest of it is just is encoded memory. It's not actually determining, right? So the read write rule is just based on that very. It's really based on that local cell, and then you just make the next determination, and it doesn't even matter about the state of the rest of the tape, frankly. Um, and so and it certainly doesn't matter how that tape got that way. So it's I don't think it's autoregressive. I think a Turing machine is inherently just it's a finite state machine with memory, and so it's inherently not and the memory is it's not an autoregressive kind of memory. Although like you would say, well maybe that's the same thing, but I guess no. The point is right. It's not. When it's doing the read write rules aren't taking into account the entire history at all. Whereas in a autoregressive system like large language model, the write rule, right, the read write, it's reading in the history, the entire history, and and in its particular order, in order to determine what to do next. So I don't think Turing machines would qualify as being
I don't
autoregressive
think
in that
the
way.
difference there is particularly coherent because our brains or like any kind of like system, it's not really going to look into the past. It's going to have memory of its past states at the very at the very most.
Yeah.
And I'm not entirely sure since like the Turing machine's like universal, if that would kind of imply that nothing is autoregressive, or if I'm just
Uh,
horribly confused.
No. I mean, it's and you can so yeah, Turing machines are the computations universe. You can solve anything, anything that's computable, and so you could always instantiate a problem as a Turing machine. And in the case of, say, a large language model, you could build a Turing machine that does what large language models do. It would just be incredibly inefficient. But you'd have to do it in such a way that you'd continuously, would have to rewrite and write the entire context and then update and then, and then go through the entire context again to get the next update. So you certainly could do it. Um, but it's not inherently autoregressive in the same way. So in the case of the brain, the idea is that you've got, or in the case of large language models, is you've got this kind of efficient way of incrementing this residual, this contextual memory, and you just keep feeding that through. You could do that with a Turing machine. You could certainly uh, create a large language model using a Turing machine doing its finite state kind of thing. And then the context would be the tape. The tape would be, you just read, you'd have to fill in the entire the entire context, and it would have to read every cell, have to have enough states so that it could read every cell, update based on, I mean, it'd be very hard to do. It's not an efficient way to do it. But it's certainly, yeah, it's computable is going to encompass certainly large language models as well. But there's a substantive difference here, and I understand your kind of skepticism maybe. The brain, in this case, the argument is that the brain has this kind of memory, has an efficient way of encoding the past sequence. It's probably not like large language models where you've got literally a verbatim everything that we've talked about like today in this long conversation. We don't have all those tokens available, but you've got some sort of compressed form that allows me to like in some ways use what I talked about an hour and a half ago to generate what I'm currently saying. And so yeah, the thesis is that the brain is encoding that kind of memory in a way that's efficient enough that you can do it like a large language model. It gets compact. By the way, what large language models do, just I don't want to get too into the weeds, is really they compact everything into this one hidden state of the last token. That's how they do their guess. They don't really need to read the entire sequence again. They're able to just read off this very dense hidden state of the last token and use that, which encompasses all of the other tokens and their respective attention weights. And then based on that compressed version, it's able to guess the next token. So and LSTMs also do this kind of compression. LLMs do much less compression. They have to throw away. They don't really have to throw away they can have all of the tokens kind of represented in the dense representation of this single last token. But our brain is presumably doing something similar to that. What we've
So
got, what
you're
I'm
saying
talking to you
that
now.
okay, so you're saying that the LLMs they have this last token compressed thing, and
Yeah.
essentially they then use that to figure out what the next token should be, and then
Yes.
they update that last token thing. How is
Correct.
that different from a like Turing machine, which you could design to do the exact same thing, where it just stores like the last token, like compressing in memory?
It's different because,
Um,
well, in the Turing machine, there's no way to get that cell. I mean, whatever you're looking at right now, if you're just looking at a particular location on the tape, it doesn't have that. It's not going to be. You can't get that compressed information there. You have to, the reason why LLMs work so well is because you can do this whole parallel processing thing with the GPUs, so that you can read off and do all these multiplications based on these big fat vectors, and you're doing this vector multiplication. That big vector contains that hidden state. The big vector contains within it uh, basically all the other tokens multiplied by the various attention weights, and then summed, and then you end up with this long vector that sort of implicit within it is all that other stuff. But it's this giant hypervector. Well, talk to Will and Misha because I know they've worked on these hyperdimensional Turing machines, and maybe you could. Maybe I'm thinking about this. Maybe too. I'm being short-sighted about it. Maybe you could think if you're dealing with a hyperdimensional Turing machine where each sort of cell is a very long vector, maybe you can do things, and maybe you could sort of do something very similar. But it still would be autoregressive in that you'd have to update whatever that cell is based on your output. What were your the previous one and whatever your write rules are. So yeah, I don't know. I don't. I'm not. I don't know if I'm taking a strong stand against the possibility of encoding this in a Turing machine. I don't know if it's efficient, but
hmm. Okay, I'm going to end my question here. I still don't really understand the difference between autoregressive and not autoregressive, and I'm not entirely sure there is a coherent difference, but
okay.
I'll probably ask our other
That means I
lab
have
mates
not
about
achieved
it.
my goals today.
Sorry.
So I need to go back to, no, thank you. It's maybe I have to think about it a little bit more to make it more explicit, or maybe you're right that there isn't a very clear distinction. But let me just really quick. It's like the function itself, right? When we talk about the LLM, the function itself, the neural network, what that function is it takes in a sequence and then it only produces it. All it can do is produce a single token out. And the only way to get language out of that is to then take that token that it's produced and do this recursively. You have to take the output and feed it back in to the system in order to get it to produce that output. If the only way to get the output that you want is to continue to iterate, to recursively feed in the input, feed it back, put it back in, feed that output back in as input, and increment, that's autoregressive. If you have some other way to encapsulate that somehow with like the Turing machine in a way that doesn't do that, then I say, okay, you're right. It's not autoregressive. It's not fundamental. But as far as I can tell, that's the only way that these systems do what they can do. And that is a true computational distinction. I think it's a true computational distinction, that the function doesn't have within it the capacity to output the entire sequence. It only has the capacity to produce a single output, single token, plug it back in with the rest of the sequence, and then go.
Okay, but it's also outputting not to the user, but to itself, the last token thing that's updating. It's essentially a recurrent neural network, as far as like was this description.
It is a recurrent network, except no, because a recurrent network is only working with its internal states. It doesn't have access to it's not able to re-input the entire sequence up till then. You could build a recurrent network that would do that, and then you'd end up with an LLM. But what's special here is that you're able to have this history that you're incrementally adding onto, when that's not inherent in a recurrent network, standard recurrent net. If you do that, then you end up with an LLM,
Okay.
and that becomes autoregressive. Dugan, what are your thoughts on? I'm sorry, I don't feel like you got a really good chance to respond.
I feel cognition is a sequential. It is what you're paying attention to. Is what it is, an attention mechanism, and you're typically
Attention
thinking
is all
about.
you need.
That's right. You're typically
Are you
thinking
trying to
about.
say that you cannot pay attention to more than one thing at a time?
No, we can pay attention to more than one thing at a time, but you know, if you have a background process like playing bridge or solitaire while you're watching a documentary, you're paying attention to the documentary and leaving the learned skill on auto, auto process basically, that or some sort of, not a muscle memory but a thought memory.
What memory? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Not so much a muscle memory for playing solitaire on your computer while you're paying attention to something else, but a thought memory that you don't
I
have
didn't
to.
understand the word that you use, and I apologize.
A thought memory is I just coined this term. I don't know if it's.
No wonder.
Can you spell it? I couldn't understand what you said, sorry.
Thought as in thinking, thought memory.
What's the word you said?
THOU.
Oh, just
Oh,
thought memory.
Okay, sorry,
Thought memory.
I apologize.
Yeah.
But
So.
what is the thought memory? I mean, the thought memory is the memories that you use to speak to each other, even.
Sure. If thought memory might be, you see like the solitaire, you see like an ace pop up and you want to go put it in like the little square, right? Or you
Right, but if you play in bridge,
next.
you can. Right, but if you play in bridge, you can't do that anymore, right?
Well, I don't know how to play bridge, so I can't really speak to that. But you see a state of cards, whatever the state of the game is, and you just sort
Okay,
of.
wait. If you play in chess, which
Sure.
is, you have to think a little bit in order to be able to do it, right? You can't just do it on automatic pilot of the previous knowledge, right?
Maybe at the beginning of the game where you have like, these sort of openings,
Yeah. But what
All right,
about in the
so
middle of the game? And if you're able to do it reasonably successfully and still repeat to people what you watched in a documentary at the same time.
well, then I would say that you're not. I'm not sure. I mean, I wouldn't play chess in the background so much if it was a hard game.
Right. Like you
But
could
it
make a
would be
choice
interesting
in
if something
chess.
that was sufficiently challenging could be done in the background.
Yeah.
That would
Well,
be interesting. Yeah.
I do it all the time.
You're
Sorry.
doing it right now. You're doing it right now. You admitted it.
Sorry.
That's good. We like that.
I apologize.
But you have to be really good at
yeah.
it.
I'm sorry?
Actually,
You have to be really good at it. You know,
It's
you
only
couldn't do that. If you were
acceptable
learning
if
how to
you're
play bridge,
crushing
you
it.
could never do that.
I guess the next question then is, can you learn, relatively difficult tasks in the background while you're doing something else?
Hmm.
Because when
So
you're
I
learning
Right.
something
I
new
think
for
that's
the
a very
first
good
time, that's
question.
particularly difficult.
So I had a cousin who used to do reasonably difficult math while he had guitar on his laps, and he was trying to, write a song at the same time.
So I would
There, that's music
say
there.
that he's
So you know what
alternating.
this sounds like? Have you heard of super taskers?
I have
They're like
never heard that term.
multitaskers, but a super task is sort of a task, and then you have something that's bigger.
It,
But
there's a finiteness to attention. Is that like are we saying there's not, or there, like I think something like getting around that. It's just infinite or not.
it's totally finite.
Right. So I think
Limited
there's a
resource.
sort of, are we getting to how there's some allocation. You can't just sort of reproduce it. You can't, you have, we're getting at the limits of the focus or attention, whatever you want to say. I think that's what we're trying to get at. I kind of forgot what the original question when you were saying the thought memory. I was trying to go back to that, but I don't know how to get back to that.
I'm
The question
sorry.
was about what? Go ahead.
I didn't mean to divert everybody. I'm just trying to think out loud.
No, but we're getting at this. We keep coming back to sort of the same ideas, like, and in my mind, it's like, okay, what can you do outside of? Is central attention qualitatively different, and there's stuff you can do in there that you just can't do outside of it, right? You're playing bridge while you're listening to this conversation. Is that really possible? Maybe what you're doing, and this is the kind of thing people talk about in attention literature. Maybe what you're really doing is toggling back and forth. You're kind of dipping in, listening to this, then you're quickly monitoring the game, and you're like, okay, that becomes part of your central attention just for a brief moment.
Driving and texting.
Absolutely, there is no question about it. In fact, I was going to tell you about the contradicting in a way myself, that that's exactly what's happening. But from me talking to you, especially considering it's my foreign language, as you can hear, you wouldn't be able to digest.
No, you've done a very good job of covering. I agree. This is actually, it's an orthodoxy in the attention literature. That's something called selective attention. Is this idea that you can't really pay attention to two things at once. There's no such thing. That all you can do is you pick one, and the other one, if you're doing it, it's automatic processing. It's not the same thing, and that's generally that's sort of a standard view in the attention literature. But we're calling that into question a little bit. Like there seems to be things that you can kind of do, like writing, like driving, and they call it automatic processing. Driving is like the classic example of automatic processing. You don't need to pay attention to that. Now, what does that mean exactly? You still need cognitive resources to do it. And then the question is like, in my mind, the question is like, really, is there a bright line? Maybe, because I think the bright line may be like sequential auto-regressive processing versus just like stimulus response, stimulus response. Maybe driving is just stimulus response. You don't need to run anything more complicated than that. And in order to do anything more complicated, you have to pay attention. And maybe you can't do two sequential kinds of processing at once. Although you can think about a song while you're doing other kinds of sequential processing.
Again, I'm asking, I'm going to go back to chess. That's not sequential processing. I'm sorry. Maybe on the first 5 moves or whatever. I don't play chess. I don't have a spatial intelligence because of my aphantasia, but I'm assuming that after the first 5 moves, if you're playing with somebody who is on your level, it's not automatic anymore.
Yeah, I
It's
would
not.
agree with that.
If you want to play chess very badly, you can just make a choice. Like, oh, the knight moves here.
Yeah, and you're just doing it right, exactly.
The difference is in how much you're giving a damn about making a really great strategic move that goes somewhere. If I'm driving down the road, if I'm playing checkers with a nephew, and I'm like, oh yeah, let's just do this. That's a very different task than my life is depending on winning the grandmaster, the chess game of play. So I think that's sort of a missing part of the conversation on that end.
I think that's great. I mean, in speed chess, if you're really good, you can just do this sort of very quick template matching, like boom, here's what I do. You don't have to do that kind of more engaged kind of thinking. But if you're playing if you're playing for keeps and it's it's an important game and you got to think about it, you can't do that while you're having a conversation. They're mutually exclusive.
Another thing also to think about is I have to take a shot about to bring up cultural computing and social computing, but can you actually talk to multiple people at once? Right? So for instance, in terms of we think of multitasking in our heads, but sort of what about externalized multitasking where you can deliver a message through a kind of language that can speak to multiple things at the same time. So it's almost that the message and the language is doing the multitasking. Right, like I think very good delegation works this way, where you send the same signal, but it can be interpreted in different ways and get the task done. This is again the whole coordination kind of thing. And one of the things that I used to think about as like a kind of experiment, as let's just say you have two very different groups of people. Can you speak with a generality, but a specificity enough where you can say the same physical words to them, but it's equally meaningful to them? Does that make sense? Like, how do you we think of multitasking internally, but what about externally? Right. So how do you get
Wait, give me
another
a
system
scenario.
outside of
What's the
yourself to
scenario?
externalize? Okay, so
I don't
let's just
understand the
say
scenario.
you and Dugan are on the call. You both have two different fields of mathematics, or maybe you're a biologist and he's a mathematician. What can I say to both of you that's equally meaningful in both of your fields? So can I say something in this case through language, right? This is where the auto-regression thing could come into. Is there some kind of optimal ambiguity of the language where it's meaningful to two very different observers? So I could say something that's meaningful to a biologist and also something that's meaningful to a mathematician, and they'll kind of understand it. And then can you increase the complexity of that where you can get them to build and do different things? Right. So maybe another way of explaining this goes back to that perceptual cryptography thing, right? Where you send out one signal, right? I'm making the same noises, but they can be useful to two different observers. Does that make sense? Is that clicking?
Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, it's in theory. I mean, it sounds very, but mutually exclusive, like understandable to observer A in one way and to observer B in a totally different way, that they're not understanding in the same way.
It sounds to me like the real limiting factor in that situation is almost nothing to do with the signal or the words themselves. It has to do with the individual states, the pre-existing history, the familiarity. Are you introducing this habit procedure for the first time or not? Like I think there's a way to do it, but the signal is sort of after the fact. Like what you're trying to coordinate would be dependent on the individual subjective things and the distances between them. So like yes, but I don't think that's the origin of the challenge, I guess.
Okay.
Interesting.
Can I make a couple comments?
Please.
Go for it.
I'm still not seeing where you raise your hand, either on my phone or my computer. I don't know what's
Sorry
going
about
on.
that.
But so I was able to turn off the
Do you
turn on
see
the
the word reactions in the bottom on your computer?
yeah, I don't see it. In the past I've seen it, but I don't see it
Okay.
now.
You have to put
If
your
you if
mouse
you
towards the bottom
if
of
you
the window.
move the mouse down, it should come up.
You would think so. Okay. I know a little, my background is synthetic biology, and I've been training NLP algorithms for over 20 years with
Cool.
regression analysis. In 2006, we started with deep learning. And I know a little bit about chess because I've been with some of the top chess players in the world. Okay. when you were talking about chess earlier, like what are they actually doing? Like DeepMind, what they did to copy what humans do, they did Monte Carlo tree search. So what the professional chess players do is they study lines, is what they call them. So they're actually looking at moves, like what do the players do and what is the outcome? And that's what Monte Carlo tree search does. So nowadays, players have software, and people aren't really playing chess anymore. They're memorizing moves. Like Magnus Carlsen is one of the few people that actually plays chess. He doesn't own a physical chessboard. Everything's in his head. And believe it or not, Kasparov memorizes moves. Okay.
Interesting.
So what I wanted to ask Dugan a question.
Yeah.
When I was studying cellular automata, weren't you originally working with biological cells?
It's possible to model cellular activity using these things. I mean, you know, one example is sort of pigment distribution in organisms. You get these sort of Turing patterns, for instance, and where each cell is responding to the pigment of its neighboring cells to decide what color to be next.
Okay, so what I was getting at is there like a transfer problem? So if you go to biological cells to neural cells to AI, can we learn something? Because from philosophy of biology, I spent quite a bit of time with that, and there's certain things we know about biological cells, like equilibrium is a driver, parsimony is a driver, and someone mentioned thermodynamics and entropy. That's also a driver with biological cells. Now, with neural cells, there's some biological component and perhaps some computing component. So, so can you take anything that you learned from the biology aspects and transfer it to AI and neural cells? Or are you starting from scratch?
It's an interesting question. So, I mean, I guess, you know, at the heart of what cellular automatas are capturing is, you know, how they coordinate signaling between them, and that's what neurons are doing. And in the sense of slower communication, you know, what we've learned from Michael Levin's work that cells communicate neighbor to neighbor using ionic potentials to coordinate what kind of tissues that they're going to grow into. And so it's you know, signaling, coordination, this kind of thing, and you know, short neighbor to neighbor communication.
It would be interesting to see a comparison of AI in a biological cell, like what you can learn. I'm not hearing a lot of talk about that, but okay. Yeah, I just took off from work. I was on my phone and I couldn't really do much. Someone mentioned on eye tracking, it's not thinking, it's subconscious. At Duke University, we have a lot of neuroscientists, Dan Ariely, and some other people. I worked on like 30 or 40 of those projects, and I'm not sure why you're saying it's subconscious because we have
That was me.
a lot of clients for business. They want to see what are people actually looking at on the screen. And I think don't people make a mental choice if you look at this as opposed to this? Or
Generally, no. I mean, it's not really seen as voluntary, but generally, if you start thinking about where you move your eyes, it's kind of like thinking about where you're moving your feet when you're dancing. You don't usually engage in sort of voluntary control over it, and it's actually it's the superior colliculus. It's like it's largely seen as even as a discrete neural module that's modulating it, and you can like breathing, you can override it, and you can say I'm going to move my eyes here, but generally. People have no idea where they're moving their eyes and aren't thinking about it in any sort of conscious sense. And it's usually seen as kind of an involuntary
Well, I
kind
could
of behavior.
I could see where you're not thinking about it, but you're consciously making a choice. Like you're saying,
Yeah,
I
I mean,
would rather,
those are like, you know,
like if you're on
it's a
Amazon,
mirror.
you're saying, I would rather look at these shoes than these shoes.
Because you like them, but you're not really thinking, hey, I'm going to move my eyes over there. The eyes kind of follow the liking, not the other way around. You don't think I like that, so I'll move my eyes there. Or rather, you don't think I'm going to move my eyes there. You like it, and so you find yourself looking at it. It's not really. It's again, it's sort of like breathing, right? I mean, you breathe heavily when you're engaged in exercise or when you're anxious or something, and so it's responsive to conscious stuff. But you're not really consciously or voluntarily um, choosing how to breathe or how to move your eyes. That's usually again these are fuzzy kind of distinctions, but I can tell you that generally the literature doesn't treat it as quite the same kind of voluntary behavior as say talking or moving other body parts.
Well,
Like
so
again,
if your brain is using a cognitive neural network and saying, I don't want to do this, and I'm moving to another object, or is it some kind of sixth sense where it's more of a feel?
I think it's more like the cognitive neural network, and that's why these distinctions aren't maybe that meaningful. Like, everything is probably just a neural network, and even voluntary behavior is also kind of automatic in some ways. I don't know that these are truly that meaningful distinctions, but in the case of eye movements, there really is a separate brain structure that's thought to largely control them, and so it's not really cortical, although there's cortical feedback to it. So that's what people think it may, and it has an analog in other species. There's the tectum in like non-mammalian species that controls eye movements. So people propose that it's kind of its own almost distinct system from the other stuff, even though you can bring it under voluntary control. So it does have this kind of flavor of being involuntary.
Okay. The final thing I was going to ask Dugan, when you're doing the cellular automata, so like what drivers are you using? Is there some type of reinforcement learning? Or is it unsupervised learning? You're just letting it figure out things on its own?
So there's just, I have a rule and I'm just seeing what happens as I change parameters into it. So there's no like reinforcement happening in that regard.
So what's motivating it? Why is it doing anything?
What do you mean by motivating it? Yeah, so like why do these patterns come out that are so intricate and complex and do all these behaviors
So
based on the
it's
simple
just
rules?
programmed to perform a function and it just does it?
Exactly, and then we just kind of see what the function does. And these functions do all kinds of things.
Okay, so when you ask what are the drivers, I I don't understand like what's going on. I mean, it's just doing what you tell it to do. And
Yeah,
you're
you
just
have a row of pixels, and then you have a rule that takes that as input and spits out another row of pixels, and then you create the history of that image, the image as the history of that sequential computation.
okay. One of the things I could think of that could cause problems. So like they were studying fish in the Antarctic and the Arctic. And like, why aren't these fish freezing to death? And these different fish, they came up with different algorithms using different genes to produce a chemical that's basically antifreeze. And they did it totally differently. So, and I heard a couple people saying there's more than one way you can do this.
So they had different modes of adapting to the environment,
Well, they
of
came up with
producing antifreeze
the
blends.
same solution, but using different genes. Like you would think these fish would be related, but they're not related at all. They're similar to other fish like swimming in Canada. And they have nothing to do, the North and the South have nothing to do with each other. They just came up with different solutions.
But yeah, as a necessity to be in that water, you have to be able to have, you can't allow yourself to be an organism that freezes at that temperature. So the only things that would evolve to be in that environment are ones that have an adaptation at antifreeze blood, for instance. So there's, I guess there's something in the blood that they put protein wise, some sort of protein gets made, distributed in the blood, and the blood becomes lowers its freezing temperature.
Well, it just this particular chemical structure, when it gets cold, it doesn't turn to ice. And it's basically why we have antifreeze, because we learned how they do that.
And I guess in antifreeze, we took one of those structures and
We did
adapted
something
that.
similar to what they did. So chemists in the lab, they said, well, if we put this particular chemistry at minus 20 degrees, it doesn't freeze.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, like, doesn't salt do that to water? Salt water freezes at a lower temperature than regular water.
I would, yeah, it's different.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious how you could transfer what we know from biology to AI. But maybe we could talk about this another time, because I've been working like 10 hours today and I'm
Yeah,
tired.
let's save this for another conversation because there's a lot of different places we can go with.
Okay. Yeah, this was great.
Awesome. All right, let's start to wrap up now. Let's see. Alon and Dugan, if you have any, 1 second. Alon, wait, there
Alon
we go.
dropped.
All right, Alon and Dugan, if any of you have any lasting comments or things you want to make. If Alon dropped off, maybe it was by accident or something. But Dugan, any lasting thoughts for everyone here today?
Yeah. No, I don't know. No, I don't really have anything else to add.
Any questions for people to think about afterwards, besides all the millions of questions we brought up right now?
Try to pay attention to how you think. I think it's, I just want to reiterate, I think that the consciousness that we are thinking that we are, our central mode, what is our attention? Who are we inside our brains? It's like this attention mechanism. It's paying attention to thoughts that are, that that are difficult to think next. That is, thoughts we've already thought about are sort of learned, and then those can be automated as processes that occur elsewhere in our brain. But the central part of our brain is sort of like this thing that's happening, where we're trying to carve into the unknown thoughts and make some headway.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of strings we can go off of for the next conversation, even though kind of one of the goals I want to get at was see where the auto-generative theory kind of synergizes with the cellular automata and all that. But I'll just cover for Alon in case he had to drop off. But you can basically find Alon, Professor Alon Barinholtz, at Alon_Barinholtz on YouTube. You can just type in his name. Similar thing for Twitter/X. And he also has a Substack, all of which will be linked below because this is going on his channel. But I guess maybe the last thing that I would say is, one, I agree with exactly what Dugan said. But the other thing is that, a lot of times when we think about things and we talk about these things, is we are trapped in a very specific way of viewing and thinking about it. Right. This is why I always harp on about the unknown unknowns and the blind spots you don't know that you have. Because one of the things I want to talk about earlier, to tie everything together really, is that, remember that conversation we had about the sticks and the stones and the fire, right? Is that technically the kinds of, the instructions and the information is technically in those sticks to make fire. They just have to be constrained and, cognition in order to kind of do it. And I think there's a lot of things that we think about, including thoughts themselves, that are only slices of a much larger space of possible thoughts or ideas. And I think, um, just be aware of that. Be aware of, I think, maybe the limitations of the ways in which we're currently thinking. And the funny thing is that even if you go into another mode of thinking, you're probably also limited in just some other way that you haven't thought about. But yes, that would be it for this Polymath Salon. Let's wrap up now, and I'll catch everyone for the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you.